We had been discussing in verse 9 last week, but this is a section that started in verse 1 and goes through verse 12, that dealing with Paul and his bringing the gospel to them in all sincerity. And he makes the point that he was successful in verse 1, but he was opposed as a preacher in verse 2. In verse 3, he talks about his sincerity. And in verse 4, how he pleased God and not man. Did not use flattering words as a result, verses 5 and verse 6. Verse 7 and verse 8, he was gentle toward them. And now then in verse 9, he's dealing with the fact that he supported himself. He says, for you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. The idea of chargeable is that idea that it's the same word that he uses elsewhere in relationship to taking support, financial support. He had not taken financial support of them. Instead, he labored and travailed, laboring night and day to support himself. He recognized that he had the right to take financial support from them, but he did not have the obligation to. Get some words that are used. It's not mandatory that he take financial support. It was authorized for him to take support, but it was an authorized optional matter, as opposed to an authorized mandatory matter. An illustration that we have used in the past, it is an authorized mandatory action that we come together on the first day of the week. And 1 Corinthians 11 would say stayed in the same place. It is an authorized optional matter as to what time we come together on the first day of the week. Whether we, let's say, start at 9 o'clock, or if we started at 6 o'clock in the morning. I got some dirty looks there. I was going to go earlier. Let's go to 5 o'clock in the morning. I had to be 1 o'clock in the morning. Some people would like that. Or whether it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Those times are optional in relationship to a authorized mandatory action. So understand the differences. Paul, as he went around, when he was supporting himself, he had an authorized optional matter as to his right to take money from those congregations. And then you would use the term expediency. He thought it not best to do so. But in one place, in writing to the Corinthians, he then said, forgive me this wrong. In other words, it was not the best decision to not take money from them. And he's basically saying, I should have in that case. so every situation is different, and you have to look at the situation as to what is best. But he did so to preach the gospel of God, preaching to them the gospel of God. And so Paul did preach unto them. Just as kind of an aside, if y'all still have that Greek material that I gave you, this is preached as an aorist tense verb, a completed action. I preached, completed action, the gospel to you. That's one of those situations. I know when I took my first year Greek, they always emphasized aorist tense was point action. Well, it's not always point action. That's why later grammarians, like a Daniel Wallace and others, Stanley Porter, names that don't mean anything to y'all, but they are Greek scholars, use the term completed action. It is something that has been completed. Or Wallace, I think, uses a snapshot action. A snapshot of it. That's what I have in there. Daniel Wallace has no relation to the Wallaces that we know. He is a Greek grammarian, has a book about 800 pages on Greek grammar. That's one of his books. I'm reading through Stanley Porter's Idioms of the Greek New Testament right now. It's 300 to 400 pages. I don't remember what, but somewhere in there. That's Stanley Porter's book. But Daniel Wallace has about an 800-page book on Greek grammar. I think, if I remember right, it's Beyond Greek Basics or something like that. Beyond Basic Greek. Or A.T. Robertson's Greek grammar is something like around 1,400 pages, I believe. So when I told y'all the sheet that I gave y'all is very, very, very basic, now you can start understanding a little bit what I mean, very basic. Just to give you an idea as to when we talk about a Greek word like this, preached, aorist tense, it gives you some view of it. But Paul had been entrusted with the gospel. If you look at, well, somebody turn back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. And if you read that. Okay, entrusted with the gospel. That was Paul. And so, even so, he says, we speak. Why? Because they had been entrusted with the gospel. That's how he considered it. Turn over to Romans 1 and verse 14, and you'll see his attitude. Romans 1:14. Okay. If you look at the terms Greek and barbarian, to the Greek, everyone else was a barbarian. So the Jews would say the Jews and everyone else is a Gentile. So if you say Jew and Gentile, you're embracing basically everyone. To the Greek, everyone else was a barbarian, so you were embracing everyone. To the wise and unwise, same thing.
What do you think when you think of the thing barbarian in your mind? Are you thinking of a savage or a person that wasn't civilized? What does that mean? Is the mind of a person thinking it?
Well, are you talking about to the Greek mind, or, okay, to the Greek mind, anyone who is not a Greek? But basically, it carried the idea of someone who is uncivilized. Our mind, we use the term barbarian in a little bit different way. But we would think of a kind of a wild man ready to, take a club and beat you over the head, and headhunters, people like that. That wasn't necessarily the idea of Greek and barbarian. It would just, you had the Greeks. Everyone who was not a Greek was a barbarian. Didn't matter what nationality they were. So it embraced everyone. Just kind of as an aside, you can start seeing say racism, but nationalism would be more in relationship to the people of that day. If you were not a Greek, you were a barbarian. If you were not a Jew, you were a Gentile. And they despised other groups. I don't think in America we have that type of hatred within the nationalistic viewpoint. And probably because we're a mixture of so many different nations historically. Lebanese, you were a foreigner.
It worked out, but they were
Yeah, you had to add that. They're really good people after all that. They're still not the nationalistic type of feelings that they had back then. I mean, a Jew considered a Gentile, everyone else, just totally unworthy of their association. You're not worthy of being, talking to us, to associate with us. Keeping the bloodline clean. Dale, what were you saying?
I was saying it's kind of snobbish.
Absolutely.
Superiority.
That's exactly what they were.
Look down their noses at people.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. And they weren't ashamed of it either. Well, the point that I'm making or getting to is that these were some of the problems that the early church had to overcome. Because, yes, it was a snobbish type of attitude toward everyone else. How do you overcome that within the church? Well, the Bible gives us the answers to it. And thus, Paul felt like he was a debtor to, didn't matter whether they were Greeks or barbarians. Whether they were wise, whether they were unwise, didn't matter. He felt a debtor to them. We understand what a debtor is. You have to, you go back by and borrow some money, and you're a debtor to that individual. You have to pay them back. Well, that's kind of the way in which Paul felt. I've been entrusted with the gospel. Now then, it is my duty to pay back by preaching the gospel to these people, to all people. We also know that Paul and those with him preached the gospel. They did not preach man's ideas, man's thoughts, did not preach the philosophies of man, which they did have plenty of philosophies, and in fact at Athens that was one of the major philosophical centers. The people on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, that's what they were interested in doing, talking about all of these various philosophies and debating among themselves. So they had plenty of that, but you don't see that in Paul's preaching and teaching. He preached the gospel instead. He did not preach the creeds of men. The Nicene Creed, for example, which came up and Paul should be the expert on this after teaching 325. The Apostles' Creed later on, which so many groups adhere to today, even. When was that? I stumped him. That's what happens when you get somebody on the spot and they don't have time to go back and review. But Apostles' Creed was way back then also. And if you listen to groups today, many of them adhere to those creeds. And in years past, they would ask, well, what creed do you go by? Ask members of the church, what creed do you hold to? And the answer was generally, we just go by the Bible. We don't have a creed. Or the Bible is our creed. Now then, it's what faith are you? And the proper answer, I guess, to that would be there's only one faith, and so I'm that faith. Of course, that doesn't satisfy them too much, and they get kind of upset a little bit. But I remember the story of a class, I think it was a Bible class, in which they were asking different religious groups to come in and to give them a synopsis of what they believe. And so as one after another would do so, they would hold up the creed or discipline book that they had, whether it be the Baptist discipline. I've got a couple of those. The Apostles' Creed, which others went by, or the Nicene Creed, which some went by, and they would say, this is what we believe. It's found here. And a member of the church got up and basically, well, the Bible is what we go by. And that was confusing to people. Don't you have a statement of faith? Yes, it's the Bible. That is our statement of faith. It should be, but it's not. That's the facts of the matter. Paul knew what to preach, though. Preaching to you the gospel. Might recall what Peter, or what, I said Peter, meant Paul. What Paul preached was the gospel. And that reminds us of what he tells Timothy who was also one of the ones that originally went to Thessalonica. And what did he tell Timothy? Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2. The term preached is from the Greek kerusso, and I'll say every time that I think of that or use that term, I think of the Italian opera singer for some reason. Yes. Very famous Italian opera singer. I think he's been dead for many years, but and there's a parallel that's there actually. Caruso and his singing, belted out the songs. And everyone could hear. A Caruso, as far as preaching, carries the idea of a herald or to announce, but especially in an official capacity. In other words, a king or a prince, the leaders of a city would set forth an edict or whatever, and they would send out people to herald out that which they had set forth. Now then, the herald was not the originator of the message. That came from elsewhere, the higher-ups, if you want to say. They simply announced it, spoke in an official capacity so that everyone could hear and thus would know what that edict was. Now then, consider that in relationship to we. That's what we did, Paul said, unto you, relating to the gospel of God. Paul was not the originator of the message. That's why he can call it the gospel of God. It's not his. Message came from God. He was, though, an official representative of Christ here upon this earth in the speaking forth that which God gave him to speak. That's what being an apostle or an ambassador is. And by the way, ambassador, as used in the Bible, is used of those who are apostles of Christ, not anyone today. But the idea of preached primarily it carries that idea of heralding this message. Paul proclaimed the gospel, and that gospel was of God. Again, that so shows the source or the origin of that message. The gospel came from God, not from man. And he received it in that way. He preached it in that way. So it is an important aspect as to the recognition and why he would preach the gospel and not man's philosophies or the creeds of men or the manuals or disciplines that man writes. Those originate with men. What Paul preached originated with God. And there's the old statement about if a creed says anything more than the doctrine or the gospel or the Bible, then it says too much. If it says anything less than the Bible, then it says too little. If it says the exact same thing as the Bible, then you don't need it. It's useless. And I will just not elaborate, but it's too bad that far too many, even in the Lord's church, has gotten away from preaching the gospel. It is a short moralistic stories as to how to feel good today and to enjoy yourself and to do all of these things, but very little Bible. Verse 10 then. In this, I have verse 10 as a section by itself. He lived a righteous life. And he says there in verse 10, ye are witnesses, and God also, how holy and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Paul says they are witnesses. I thought only the apostles were witnesses. Anybody can be a witness. It depends on what you're witnessing to. Here, they are not being witnesses in that official capacity as an apostle that had seen the resurrected Lord. He's saying, you witnessed how we lived, how we behaved ourselves. You here, right now, witness how I teach this class. And you can decide in your own minds whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether I'm rotten and not need to sit down and shut up, or if it's too shallow, too deep. But you are witnesses of how I teach the class. They were witnesses as to how he lived, how he behaved himself. Okay, let your light so shine among men that they may see, or we might use the term in that case, witness your good life and glorify God who is in heaven. To letting our light shine before men, letting them see Christianity in us. And as a result of that, bring glory to God. If you look back in verse 2 and verse 9, he talks about basically there being witnesses of his behavior, how he behaved himself. When he says in verse 2, but even after that we have suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know. At Philippi we were bold in our gospel to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. You know what happened at Philippi. You were witnesses of those things. Verse 9, for ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail for laboring night and day, and we would not be, because we would not be chargeable to any of you, we preach unto you the gospel of God. Remember, brethren. How could they remember? Because they had seen, they had witnessed what he did. But ye are witnesses, and God also. God was their witness. Look back at verse 4 and verse 5. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our heart. For neither at any time use we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness. So again, calls upon God to be a witness for him. That was, in verse 4 and 5, specifically their preaching. God is witness of our preaching. Here, it's his whole life. Now then, can we judge? Well, obviously we can, because Paul is calling upon these Thessalonian brethren to judge him and how he behaved himself among them. They could judge his actions. Could they judge his motives? We can only judge motives inasmuch as someone reveals those motives to us. But God, who judges the heart, can judge the motive. And so he says, ye, talking about the Thessalonians, and God, you judge the actions, God can judge the motives. And the term witnesses, it's the Greek word martus. It is used in a legal sense of one who is an actual spectator of something. It is also used in another way in the Bible, and that is someone who dies that of a martyr. In fact, you can probably could connect martus with martyr. That's someone who's witness. It involves two aspects. One, personal knowledge, and two, the ability to speak about this personal experience. So a personal knowledge and the ability to speak about it. Both of those are involved in being a witness. We hear those today who talk about being a witness for Christ. Number one, where is their personal knowledge? Not something that they read in a book about Christ. Their personal knowledge of Christ, and then ability to speak about it. Well, they might have ability to speak about something, but they do not have a personal knowledge of it. They're relying upon others. In a court of law, when you rely upon someone else, even something that someone tells you, and you then start to tell the judge, they said this to me, no, can't accept that. That's hearsay evidence. Has to be personal knowledge. And even though we might say that's personal knowledge, it's not recognized as personal knowledge. It is what he has told you. And so you're telling something that somebody else said. That's why it's hearsay. We cannot witness for Christ today because we do not have that personal knowledge. Those who had the personal knowledge, they are the ones who wrote down their testimony. And we now have that personal testimony that they gave in the Scriptures, the New Testament. And we can preach and proclaim that But that doesn't make us a witness. They were the witnesses. And I am to faithfully set forth that which they witnessed. I can speak of what they testified to. Now then, to come full course with this term witnessing, many in the denominational world who speak of witnessing for Christ today are using the term witness in a proper way. Now, that may surprise some of you, but they are using the term in a proper way because of their denominational beliefs. And these are false beliefs, but they're denominational beliefs. God does something to me to enable me to become a Christian and to remain a Christian. And thus I am giving my testimony, I am witnessing to what God did to me. Now, that's not how to become a Christian. The Spirit doesn't work in that way, but that's their view. And so they would be using the terminology correctly. The problem is, what they are witnessing to is false. We've heard about for years the old mourner's bench religion. Someone in mourner's bench waiting for an experience from God that would say that that God has saved that individual. And so when they get this experience, they would then witness that experience to the group, and they would vote on whether or not that experience which they witnessed, which they went through, was one of salvation or not. That proves that you're saved. And so they were in effect using the term witnessing in a proper way. The only thing is, the whole system is false. So understand that as well. You can use the term in a proper way, even though the testimony might be false. We have to then determine whether what someone testifies to is true or false. When the apostles were able in the first century to say, "We have seen the risen Christ," they had to determine at that time, and we would really have to determine it as well, whether that witnessing which they made, that testimony that they gave, is true or false. Did they actually see risen Christ? Well, on the day of Pentecost, for example, Peter started giving, we've seen the risen Christ. God raised him from the dead, showed him openly to us. Well, how do I know that's true? Because there was an empty tomb, for one thing. That corroborated their testimony. Were the witnesses credible? Credibility means a lot. In a court of law, credibility is a huge matter. If you can prove that someone has lied on the stand, basically everything that they stated is worthless. If you can prove that they have ulterior motives, then their testimony is discredited. That's why. Hmm?
Peter was telling them at that time in Pentecost, this is the evidence you have. So they have seen what they were doing.
Well, that's the thing, though. Was Peter and the apostles' testimony credible or not?
That's why they had to prove it.
That's what they had to do, is prove it. And he proved it thus by going back into Old Testament history and proving that that was going to be prophesied. He proved it by the empty tomb. But then we look back on it and we start seeing their lives and we look at their credibility, and were they credible? And lawyers have actually written books dealing with the credibility of the apostles, proving that they were credible. You take every criteria that the legal profession would set forth in relationship to credibility, and they passed. So they were credible witnesses. And then the additional evidence gave additional credibility to what they were saying. Were there people who were not credible witnesses, even during the time of Christ and there immediately afterwards? Don't you remember in Matthew the 24th chapter, and talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that there would be many false Christ? And people would be saying, lo here, lo there. So there's a lot of false testimony that was being given. And they were not to be taken in by that false testimony. We'll stop at that point because Paul gives then three things regarding his behavior, and we wait until next time to get into those three things.